Hi, my name is Michelle Jones, and I'd like to discuss a couple factors that led to the creation of the Indiana Women's Prison, the first separate prison for women in the United States. The first was the charges of sexual violence, physical abuse, and children being born by women incarcerated at the Indiana State Prison South in Jeffersonville. The second was the perceived inundation of prostitutes in Indianapolis after the Civil War. Roughly this time period is between 1865 and 1870. In 1868, Governor Conrad Baker enlisted the help of Rhoda Kauffman and Charles Kauffman to investigate both the northern and southern state penitentiaries, the latter of which held women as well as men. During the investigation at Indiana State Prison South, allegations of sexual exploitation and physical abuse was reported to the Kauffmans during their visit. One inmate told Rhoda, "A number of the guards had keys to the women's prison and entered when they wished to gratify their lusts. If the women could be bought up, they gave them trinkets or goods out of the government stores. If they did not yield, they were reported as incorrigible, stripped and whipped in the presence of as many as wished to look on." Rape and sexual violations were easy to accomplish in Jeffersonville, with only the protests of the women themselves easily silenced. Prison officials came up with sexually exploitive games for their amusement. Such games included stripping the women naked and enforcing them to run along the course. Others included running along to the reservoir in which to wash themselves naked for the pleasure of themselves and their friends. Harry J. Bonka was incarcerated at Jeffersonville at this time, and he wrote an expose, an explosive book that detailed some of the instances that occurred in Jeffersonville at this time. One of the things that he discussed in detail was Colonel J.B. Merriweather, the inebriated warden. And he discovered, and he reported to us, that he was as culpable as his subordinates, and women therefore lived under the constant threat of violence. Merriweather went so far as to charge his guards $10 a month for open-ended use of the women in the female department. He himself was discovered with a woman in her cell by an employee who received a sudden promotion later. Allegations that the warden kept a concubine of women in his mansion recast the prison into a quote-unquote vast bawdy house. Children were born, essentially living in the midst of a state-operated prostitution ring. The Greencastle Press reported, "The women in the prison ring led lives not a whit better than before their imprisonment. Such a thing as reform was never heard of. Guards gave them whiskey, tobacco, and opium." Sexual violence and physical violence was an integral part of American life for incarcerated women in the 19th century. Fallen women, whether they had committed a crime or not, was removed from the ranks of respectability and affixed with a taint. In the case of women at Jeffersonville, having been convicted, they lost their privileged place in the eyes of prison officials, guards, Christians, and other women. Therefore, the consequences were few. Once the exploitative conditions at Jeffersonville was exposed, Merriweather was removed, but that was the only consequence until the women were finally removed from the prison in 1873. So now let's take a look at the inundation of prostitutes. After the Civil War, prostitutes were thought to be everywhere and was considered a bane of Indianapolis society. In 1870, a chronicler of that time wrote that in the inundation of prostitutes, they flaunted their gay shame in every public place. They crowded decency in its own defense, out of sight. Their bag of noise polluted every street. The mayor felt compelled to find a place for these women to go. Land was donated just beyond the southern suburbs for prostitutes to be sent from the county courts. The message: keep the deviant influence of prostitution far from our city of good citizens and pure women. A house of refuge was commissioned to be run by the Sisters of the Good Shepherd, a Catholic order of nuns, in 1863. The construction was stopped in 1864 due to the war, and a temporary home was made for the women in the heart of downtown Indianapolis. For reasons the chronicler of Indianapolis failed to report, it was clear having prostitutes in the heart of downtown caused many problems. Another location was secured and finished with funds from another organization, a Quaker organization called the Homes for Friendless Women, and it opened its doors in 1866. The facility had a capacity for 100 women. However, by 1870, there were 225 women in the registry. The Home for Friendless Women caught fire in 1870 and burned to the ground. In the end, the Sisters of the Good Shepherd did open a house for Good Shepherd in 1873 on the original land that was abandoned, a few months before the reformatory opened for its women in 1873. The Magdalene Laundries, named for Mary Magdalene, herself an alleged prostitute, was a place of reform and repentance where women could wash away their sins. The idea of an institution to control and rehabilitate prostitutes and vulnerable populations of women spread quickly and was embraced by Catholic Ireland, England, and America. The sisters were invited to America in 1848, 13 years after their founding, to assume a leadership of an existing lay-managed Magdalene Laundry. Oddly enough, the main reason for creating the Indiana Reformatory for Women and Girls was for the reformation of fallen women. But no prostitutes were held in that institution for its first 24 years. Instead, prostitutes that were believed to be the bane of Indianapolis society were held in the House of Good Shepherd and also the Homes for Friendless Women. But let's take a little more detailed look at the reformatory itself. Indiana was the first state in the Union to recognize that if women were to be incarcerated, they needed a separate facility. Public embarrassment over the sexual violations and physical abuse at Jeffersonville was the catalyst for prison reform. The Indiana Reformatory Institution for Women and Girls holds a historical distinction of being the first separate prison. It opened in 1873 and is a unique example of prison reformation and female determination. Sarah Smith, a Quaker like Rhoda and Charles Kauffman, was named the superintendent of the new institution. She and her husband, James, joined the Kauffmans in receiving the women from Jeffersonville and those who followed from county courts, all of them except for convicted prostitutes. The reformatory's goal included religious indoctrination, basic education, and training in women's domestic skills and labor. Sarah Smith, in one annual report from the reformatory, echoed that her belief that Christianity was the solution to all ills of fallen women, particularly women of the lower class. She stated, "Our position is felt to be one of no small responsibility, whether in rescuing the little waif of misfortune against whom all doors seem to be closed, in striking contrast with the overindulged and incorrigible, the orphan, or the one having a step-parent, which class, sad experience teaches us, is the ones most demanding our sympathy, as these are most frequently thrown upon the world to be led captive by some designing man who robs her of her virtue ere she knows its value, and too soon she becomes the pest of society. Betrayed herself, in pure revenge seeks to betray others, and at the same time spreading disease and immorality wherever she goes." Smith acknowledged that men led women and girls to ruin, and she was quick to condemn tainted, gender-deviating prostitutes or other ruined women as vengeful, and even though sex work in many cases became one of the only strategies for survival left for them. Apparently, nothing is to be done about the designing men. Through reifying patriarchy and indoctrinating religion, Sarah sought to quell sexual agency by reconstituting and reorienting women in her own image, the fair lady, which she believed was a proper woman's place. Sarah Smith and the reformatory staff made great strides in reforming fallen women according to their standards, and reported in 1878 an 82% success rate of women and girls re-entering society. But all wasn't well. The facility was one large structure, and there were difficulties in keeping girls separated from the real criminals, women in the female department. There were growing concerns about protecting the girls from bad influences. There were also challenges of the small staff of 11, faced with supervising on average 27 adults and 100 girls. Some undoubtedly disinterested in the reformatory's goal. It isn't difficult to imagine pockets of resistance amongst the women and girls disadvantaged by criminal taint, race, sex, gender, class, and even marital status, particularly in matters of sexual agency. It was efforts to wipe out these pockets of resistance that resulted in the 1881 investigation by a legislative committee. There were allegations that Dr. Parvin, the on-site physician, had conducted operations upon the women, some of whom he had access to 24 hours a day for 10 years, for reasons that were not always made known to them. Several of these women testified against him. There were also allegations against Sarah Smith, who had beaten women and girls or ducked them in cold water in a 19th century version of waterboarding. There were allegations that she stripped them naked and to hose them down, knocked their heads against the wall, in addition to placing them on bread and water diets as punishment. Punishment for what? Self-abuse, which is also masturbation. Sarah Smith and the employees were dedicated to reforming the inmates, yet once some of them already out of place of acceptable religious and social norms decided to indulge in masturbation and step further out of place, Smith and the reformatory employees responded with violence. The following are a few testimonies given to the legislative committee by employees, women and girls, at the reformatory in the 1881 investigation. Frances Talbert was employed in the reformatory's laundry for 5 years, and she states that the severest case of punishment she ever saw was the ducking of Lizzie Smith, age 13. She was stripped, put in a bathtub, and held down by Auntie Smith, Sarah Smith, while a large girl turned on the cold water tap. The girl was ducked there for 20 minutes, then taken out, dried, spanked, and sent to bed. This was for self-abuse and for teaching the vice to smaller girls. Amanda Lamper, an ex-offender, testified that the treatment of other women and girls and stated that Jane Johnson was severely beaten and choked, and that Susie Reynolds' mouth was cut from the strap from which she was struck. Lizzie Cash, an ex-prisoner, testified that she had been whipped several times upon her naked person, and that she'd seen Mrs. Smith take a girl and pull her hair until some of it came out. Mrs. Anna Buchanan, an ex-officer of the reformatory, testified to the committee that she had observed Mrs. Smith take girls of 12 and 15 years of age and strike their heads against the wall. These allegations were shocking to the legislative committee, but it was Sarah Smith's testimony that illuminated why such devout Christians would resort to alarming physical violence. The following is a short excerpt of 3 hours of testimony. We had hoped that we could do without the whipping. Mrs. Smith went on to describe consequences of self-abuse on the part of the children, and to cure this, she said, "We adopted the bathing, which has been called ducking." Ms. Smith explained that an epidemic of self-abuse among the girls necessitated drastic action. She states, "I could not stop it by any other mode of punishment than by using cold water. I do not deny that we have punished severely in some cases, but I could show 50 letters from prisoners thanking me for the treatment given. I've never used anything but the hose, the slipper, and the strap to punish any of the inmates. I have never knocked a girl's head against the wall, except upon slapping their faces. I have never whipped any woman with the strap, except upon the shoulders and arms. I positively deny that I ever deliberately knocked a girl's head against the wall. I have slapped their face when they were impudents to officers. I have often pulled their hair when they have done the same to other girls, to let them see how they liked it. When I used the bath, I did it entirely for the purpose of frightening them and as a deterrent. I have no recollection that cold water was used in the bath when they were first put in. Later, she states that the water from the faucet was cold." She goes on, "The board makes the rules to govern an institution, but there is no law regulating punishment. I believe the Lord called me to take charge of this institution. I suppose the Lord also directs my methods of management." Smith confessed that she beat women and girls in the face and body severely. but with slippers if they were found masturbating, in addition to other acts of violence. In defending herself, she alluded that it was the board's failure to create laws regulating punishment that caused her to take matters into her own hands and violate the women in her charge. Further, her honest retelling of the violence inflicted by her reveals how she felt culturally, religiously, and morally justified in her actions. Believing it was her duty to save them, Sarah rationalized that in circumstances where one was in sin, physical violence was a necessary evil. And Proverbs 23:13 and 4, especially verse 14, poignantly backs up her position. It states, "Do not withhold discipline from a child. If you punish them with rod, they will not die. Punish them with rod and save them from death." Further, the pervasive sentiment of the 19th century was that the aroused female could not be trusted, and the sexually awakened female was for the brothel. In other words, Sarah Smith's position on masturbation was informed in part by widely held social and religious beliefs of the public, which pathologized and demonized the practice at the time. Sarah was clearly unapologetic in her perpetration of physical abuse and sexual violation upon the women and girls of the reformatory. The goal of Sarah Smith and others was to remake these women, deeming but redeemable, into their own image, to teach them to live by established patriarchal social and religious norms. Failing to do so, the women and girls became deviant, irredeemable, prosecutable, mirroring the dark ladies, the haunting, gender-deviating prostitutes whose sexual knowledge of self was too great a sin to subvert. What is questionable, troubling, and inexcusable, however, is the secretive and violent manner in which Sarah Smith and other employees went about correcting or redirecting unwanted behavior. It is not surprising that Dr. Parvin was cleared and Sarah Smith won the day. Indiana lawmakers in the Gilded Age were comfortable with the concept of young girls being sexually active at 12, the age of consent, as long as they were married and not masturbating. Sarah Smith and Dr. Parvin both resigned in 1883.